Dear guests, welcome back to the second panel of today's event. We are continuing our discussions on the challenges that Europe as a community of free nations faces today, challenges to its identity, solidarity, unity. In the second panel, we have three distinguished speakers, and my role as a moderator is just to manage the time and to give mics to you. The audience, of course, is encouraged to ask questions, and first of all, we will be moving to Warsaw. Dear Mantas Adomėnas will speak about democratic solidarity in the face of global threats, and Mantas is the Secretary General of the Governing Council of the Community of Democracies. So without any further delay, because we are a few minutes late we are a few minutes late behind our schedule. So, dear Mantas, the floor is yours. Approximately 25 minutes for your speech, and then we have opportunity to ask you the questions.
Thank you. I can hear. Hope you can hear. This is Donato speaking. So, hello, Donato. Hi, Federico. Good to see you on screen. Right. Okay. Well, before we talk about solidarity and how democracies can engage in solidarity, we have to assess the nature and scope of threats and the magnitude of the challenge. And when we look at and of course, I think you've been discussing Ukraine as the most salient example of challenges we face today. Especially the last stage of war, and I don't mean the use of the medium-range missiles, but the deployment of North Korean troops, I think, opened a new dimension in this conflict, where we very visibly see the cooperation of autocracies, and I think this is the sort of salient feature that we have to discuss first before moving to cooperation of democracies. It's not just Northern Korean artillery, Iranian drones, and Chinese electronics, and Belarusian airfields in the help of Russia, but actually we have to see the whole dimension of united front against democracy. And what unites those regimes is the attempt to subvert and challenge the world order, which was established in the aftermath of the Second World War, and which those regimes seek as limiting their intentions to exert geopolitical influence and power in unprecedented scale. So what we have is actually a creation of an axis of authoritarian regimes, which has been sort of unprecedented since the end of the Cold War, with the difference that, unlike the Cold War, when there was a fairly clear division of the world into communist and communist dependent camp and the free world on the other side, we have a variety of regimes with very varied ideological interests, and I already enumerated, Iranian religious or religiously sort of motivated regime, Chinese state-controlled, allegedly Marxist, but really sort of based on the ideological control, Russian theories of imperial resurgence and almost mystical resentment, and so on and so forth, as well as North Korean Marxism, and so these are the regimes that actually have very little in common in terms of positive goals. When it comes to the vision of the world, North Korean vision is incompatible with Iranian, and neither is compatible with Russian. But at the moment, they find themselves in alliance in attacking the existing international world order, insofar as they are united by a common enemy, which they see in the face of the free world. So this is not an ordinary world. It's a war. It's a war to challenge the world order, which they seek as an expression of dominance of democratic states or democratic structures. Some conflicts, and I think this is the most important and defining conflict of the coming decades. And when sometimes we hear voices that there are other wars happening in other regions of the world, sometimes even they claim more victims, but none of them is defining so far in terms of the global world order. And this is a new type of war, where weapons systems act in unison with disinformation, with sabotage, which is on the rise recently, with transnational repression, with cognitive and hybrid warfare, and attacks against Ukraine itself and supporters of Ukraine globally. And this happens on unprecedented scale and sophistication. So it is the war that is, on the one hand, is fully aware of democracy's weaknesses and is quite well adapted to exploit the weaknesses of democracies against themselves, in order finally to undermine and subvert them. For example, freedom of speech is weaponized against democracy in order to subvert the measured political discourse, which enables sound and strategic democratic political decisions to be made. If in the Cold War years, freedom of speech, freedom of information could have been was weaponized against totalitarian regimes, the broadcast of Radio Free Europe and Voice of America was used to disseminate uncomfortable information within the Soviet Union, which was eroding the communist grip on power. Freedom of information, freedom of speech no longer acts as a sort of weapon against authoritarian regimes. They have adapted, and in fact, as Peter Pomerantsev argues in his most recent book, This Is Not Propaganda, they're using the overflow of information to actually combat democratic discourse. So what I'm saying is that freedom of speech can be weaponized against democracies, but not the other way around. And this is one of the fundamental asymmetries which autocratic regimes have learned how to exploit. Another is disinformation, which while weakening democratic political systems is actually strengthens autocratic regimes insofar as disinformed and manipulated populations are so much easier to govern. Polarization is another sort of weapon in their sort of armory, insofar as polarization acts as a very strong destructive power in democracies, as we saw in the recent elections across the free world. But at the same time, polarization, identifying an enemy and directing the population against it, acts as a solidifier of autocratic or populations ruled by autocratic regimes. Likewise, economic freedom, which is guaranteed by democracies, is abused in order to circumvent the sanctions. And generally, the openness of democratic societies is exploited for the purposes of transnational repression. And I could continue that list on and on. What I'm saying is that autocracies have studied and analyzed the fundamental weaknesses of democracies in order to weaponize them in this war against the democratic political order. The other thing which is very important to note is that autocratic regimes that I enumerated, they complement each other nicely. In economic terms, in technological terms, the exchange of technologies between Iran and Russia, between Russia and China, between Russia and North Korea is well documented. And actually, this is not the case that it's one-way flow. Actually, Russia did supply some of the technologies which are crucial for China's recent development of new weapon systems, which it's going to deploy against Taiwan. So in technological terms, in energy resources, obviously, in other resources, but also in soft power terms. It's since quite a lot of my work is involved with dealing with global South countries, I can see how the propagandas and ideologies exerted by these regimes are complementary to each other, and they synergize each other. So on the one hand, you have Russian anti-colonial narrative, which is very powerful in Africa, for example, or sometimes traditionalist propaganda, which engages with some of the countries in the global South, which is complemented, and again, Iran's Islamic ideology helps direct the animosity of a number of Arabic and Islamic countries against the West, whereas China's development-based narrative and encouragement to abandon human rights considerations for the sake of development is working in other countries which are not so which cannot be reached in other ways. So the narratives of those countries they sort of also work together and reinforce each other in the international arena. So this is the war against democracy, which is, as I said, going to be the defining conflict of the coming decades, if not the rest of the century. And it is it's very important to realize that it's the war about the source of justification of global political order. Whether its result is going to determine whether sheer power is sufficient to justify itself, or does it have to be submitted to some standards to democratically express support of its citizens, for example, to human rights, human dignity, to free choice and exercise of political liberty, to legitimacy and the rule of law, and other norms of the rules-based international order. Whether power needs to submit to those considerations, or the possession of power is sufficient to justify itself. This is going to be the defining question on which principle the international global order is going to be based. And so on the one side of this division, we broadly have what we broadly term autocracies, to whom power is justification of itself, whether it's exercised under the guise of Russian revanchist nationalists or Chinese totalitarian narrative or North Korean Marxism or Iranian theocracy. Individual human beings in these narratives count only as the means to the goal, and nations are only as viable as they manage to align themselves with the interests of the great powers. Whereas human rights in these narratives, in all of them, is a fiction. Democracy is a manipulatable concept, and they invent other names for it, like sovereign democracy, illiberal democracy, or, for example, try to replace language of democracy and human rights with development, which is just another name for exercise of power. And on the other side, we have our always imperfect and sometimes very deeply flawed democratic systems. And this is the kind of the scope of challenges that we're facing at the moment. And whether democracy will survive those challenges globally, there is no guarantee whatsoever. I mean, I'm not in favor of kind of this optimistic fatalism that everything somehow in the end will be well. It may not be, and unless we stand up and fight. And this is where sort of the solidarity of democracies comes in. And in order to do that, first of all, we must realize that we are at this war. It's not local. It's not Ukraine. It's a global conflict now. And this is not going to end with the present generation, but may well continue into the next one and even the one after that. And the important thing to realize that in this conflict, there is no kind of silver bullet, no simple or straightforward answer what democracies have to do. There are aspects of very different orders of magnitude and complexity that needs to be addressed. And there are also many layers of neglect and inaction that have over the years and over these 3 decades of the vacations from history has overlaid the issue and made the problem more intractable. The Walter Mead, whom I listened recently to in Forum 2000 in Prague, very eloquently stressed that the fate of democracy is now a geopolitical issue. What that means is that preservation and even survival of democracy as a form of government is no longer a domestic issue. It's inseparable from geopolitics. It's no longer a matter of countries' internal decisions regarding the best form of governance. It is the source and the object of global conflict. So Russia's war against Ukraine is a war about determining the fate of democracy worldwide, which neither of the other wars, whether in Sudan, in Yemen, or Gaza, however sort of unacceptable and grievous they can be, they are not. So this is the exceptionality of the conflict that we are witnessing. Right, now, what can democracies do? I will start with the fact that I lead a Community of Democracies, which is an organization which was formed at the time when democracy was very much on the rise. When there was a universal kind of optimism that democracy is going to be the default form of political organization globally in the near future. And at that time, I think very important to note that democracy had dialectical advantage. It was the bearer of the new, very promising, peaceful, prosperous world order, which we had very great pains, sort of very great reluctance to relinquish for a long time. What is important to realize is that now situation is diametrically opposite. Now democracy is dialectically and conceptually at a disadvantage. Because the champions of democracy are defenders of the status quo, which is very often imperfect, quite often compromised, and always boring. Whereas autocrats, on the other hand, are challengers. They are the bearers of the new. However threatening that and unsympathetic that new reality might be, whether you look at Žemaitaitis or Alternative für Deutschland, they are the bearers of the new reality, let alone sort of China. And that partly explains their success, because democracy at the moment has no vision and no positive goal to aspire and to move towards. What democracy is saying, let's stick to what we have, and let's not move away from it. Whereas autocrats do have positive vision. Their goal is to destroy the global order, which was thrust upon them, as they claim, by the West after World War II. So one of the things that what democratic sort of world has to come together is to agree on the vision and strategy for the new democratic global order. And so democracy needs to, first of all, become proactive and assertive in order to regain initiative in this global agenda setting. And not unrelated to the previous point is that the free world has stopped arguing for democracy. Again, I mentioned Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. When I was growing up in the Soviet Union, we could, with great effort through Soviet jamming, listen to these sources of information. And in them, one could constantly hear arguments which were put forward. Why is democracy better than the Soviet communism? Why is free market better than the socialist command economy? And so on and so forth. So there was a constant debate just about the justification, trying to take on board the opponents by the arguments, the arguments by the opponents, and to respond to them. But with the end of the Cold War, and when we perceived, there was this perception of the end of history, we assumed that the democratic narrative won the ultimate kind of eschatological victory. And so we stopped arguing for it, as well as developing it further. Whereas autocrats, they never stopped arguing. And they built up their ideological narratives, which propose solution to what they see as democracy's weaknesses and contradictions. And for a very long time, we tended to view autocratic regimes as kind of dead ends of history, doomed to disappear and eventually to collapse into democracy. Well, but this is not how they view themselves, and that's very important, I think, to realize that. They see themselves as history's next stage, what comes after democracy, as an answer to democracy's problems and tensions. So what we need is very urgent is to renew this democratic narrative, adapting it to the realities of the 21st century and including into its formulation also the perspectives which are articulated by the societies outside the West, primarily in the global South. So these are the kind of meta level and higher order consensus about where democratic solidarity is needed. More practically, what can we do as a global network and a sort of community of democracies from the small c? And for once, it's very important to realize that we are acting no longer in preparation of conflict, but in the sort of conditions of the global conflict. The winter is no longer coming; it's already come. Sort of, as you can sort of realize if you look out of the window in Warsaw. What democracies have to do is, for example, share practical recipes and algorithms how to combat disinformation and to build up resilience. It's an evolving art, but when it comes to Russian propaganda, for example, Eastern European countries have extensive expertise and can provide practical recommendations on how to do it, beginning with forming stratcom structures, to media literacy training methodologies, and all the way down to involving civil society and mobilizing digital activists to combat disinformation and FIMI in social networks. Whereas Taiwan has the same expertise for Chinese disinformation. So, what democratic solidarity can do is to provide a framework in which these countries could train policymakers and government officials from the global South countries, which are only now facing up to this new, totally novel to them threat, and which have virtually no immunity to disinformation, to FIMI, and to cognitive warfare. Then we need to promulgate standards and provide templates for legislative and executive action to protect democratic societies from transnational repression, from political interference and other autocratic meddling. So restricting enablers, lifeboat schemes for Democrats and in danger, and so on and so forth. And build up structures of solidarity and cooperation to resist economic coercion from autocratic regimes. So, for example, we had the premonition of those when there was China's economic coercion vis-a-vis Lithuania, Australia, Taiwan, and so democracies need to build up something like what Anders Fogh Rasmussen speaks about, talking about economic Article 5, kind of like NATO security Article 5, but on economic matters. Because in the coming decades of conflict, one thing is very clear. Whenever there is dependency, either economic dependency, energy dependency, resource dependency, autocratic regimes will try to weaponize it against the Western world. So in order to prepare for that and to build up immunity, we need to build structures of economic, technological, resource solidarity among the democratic countries. Of course, we have to pool dwindling resources of political will to reinvigorate multilateral institutions, because fundamental problem is one of political will. Therefore, it's not possible to resolve these problems solely through practical measures. These higher order concerns which I outlined, they need to be at the forefront of thinking about democratic response to autocratic encroachment, because they need to be addressed in a sustained manner. And in order to win, we do need sort of community. We do need real alliance of democracies, real solidarity, because our strength is truly in diversity, in sort of and in complementarity. And this is not just a nice sort of phrase. The famous opening lines of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, which says that happy families are all alike, whereas every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. With political regimes, it's the other way around. The truth is the opposite, that all unhappy regimes all autocratic regimes tend to be similar in some ways, whereas democracies are fundamentally different. They bring their own histories, different experiences, and different approaches. And this is, in a sense, a very real resource of strength for democracies, because democracies do not have some of the advantages that autocratic regimes have. For example, autocratic regimes have this immense potential of concentrated political will, because they are unimpeded by diversity of opinions, by institutional checks and balances. They also have immense powers of mobilization, because they are not kind of impeded by the concern for the well-being of their citizens. They have long-term strategic planning, because they are not hindered by electoral cycles. So, autocracies have all these, resources which democracies do not have. But the only thing which democracies can oppose to their strengths is this wealth of innovation, of constant dynamism, and diversity of solution, which arises from our different histories and experiences. The fact that the democratic world is constantly looking for a variety of responses to arising challenges, and then it can learn from each other, adopting those responses. So it acts as a kind of big field of stochastic experiment, and this complementarity of democracies is a very true resource of strength, which autocracies do not have. And this is, I think, the only thing which can help us to face and overcome the challenges that the time will inevitably bring. And so, in a sense, if we can win the global conflict, it's only by finding structures to pool those resources so that they reinforce each other and they can creatively enhance the strength of individual democratic countries. Because on their own, however strong they might be, none of them will be able to face the combined resources of autocratic axis. So this is basically my thesis on democratic solidarity, and I would be happy to take one or two questions if there are any.
Okay. Thank you, Mantas, for your important insights and analysis. So it is my duty now to ask whether you in the audience have questions.
I'm sorry, I know I'm speaking too much at this conference. I already asked a question in the previous session, but the temptation, first of all, to greet you, Mantas, to send you my warmest greetings. I'm very happy to see you as sharp and good as ever. And I want to ask you a question. You are many things, right? You are a senior policymaker. You are now a best-selling novelist. You are also, and maybe you started as a conservative philosopher. And there have been various conservative approaches, I would say two broad conservative approaches throughout history to foreign policy. One of them is the classical, way of European diplomacy. That's the realist approach, right? That's the way of Metternich, that's the way of Bismarck. The foremost practitioner in the 20th century was Nerija Putinaitė, right? The other way was born on the left, in Wilsonian, globalism, if you wish, and that's the idea that we mobilize, the free world, and we see ourselves engaged in a battle to protect free institutions and repel autocratic government. And this migrated on the right during the Cold War, of course. This was the foreign policy of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And you have made in your speech a very powerful case for the second, I think, embracing the second view of foreign policy today. But my question, maybe a bit provocative to you, is, as a conservative philosopher, what do you say to why should conservatives today, from first principles, embrace the foreign policy of Wilson as opposed to the foreign policy of Metternich and Bismarck, which important, conservative voices today, starting, I mentioned Henry Kissinger on Ukraine, for example. What is the case for that kind of foreign policy, and why do we defend democracy better by adopting it instead of a more realist approach? Thank you.
Thank you. It's one of the conservative thinkers' features is to constantly innovate and to rethink and learn from whatever good happens, and then whatever good new things come to the fore. So if you look at there is this graphs which I'm sure you have seen, Federico, of how much of global population lived under democracy 150 years ago. It was tiny. So, democracy as a phenomenon is a fairly global, is a fairly new concept. And I don't agree to say that, Athens, no, it was a different regime. But democracy, the way we know it, is a fairly new phenomenon. So in a sense, we are operating under new conditions. And as I said, it's a question for individuals and a question also for nations. what kind of global arrangement they want to live under, where they they have inherent rights, nations as well as individuals, rights of self-determination, political liberty, and so on and so forth, or are they the objects of the game played by those who have power, whether it's Putin or major geopolitical players, and the small states do not have any subjectivity. And by small states, I mean very broader range. I mean Ukraine is a small state in that respect. 2 years ago, I was sitting across the table from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bangladesh, and addressing me, he said, "We as small states," and I think something like that, 200 million. But when it's compared to China and India, between which Bangladesh is squeezed, it is a small state. So this is a question of what world we want to live in, and in a sense, the structures that we are still living, this world America made, as Bob Kagan put it, was created through the concert of value-based policy makers and then players. So I'm afraid that by appealing to conservative paradigm is a appeal to the time when the order the global order that we know now had not existed yet. And these were the recipes which were developed in a very different global conditions. I think that after Reagan and Thatcher, it may no longer be possible to talk about this conservative realist paradigm without sinking into isolationist, irresponsible, and egotistic perspective, which Orban and some other players exercise or try to promote. So what I'm saying is the change of the global conditions makes the former paradigm no longer tenable as a whole. I'm not saying that conservatives should not be more realist and kind of more conscious of the realities on the ground. Had they been so, Iraq would not have happened, and the world would have been very, very different. I think a democratic ideal was in many ways compromised in nowhere else, but primarily in Iraq and in the latest debacle, which was unjustified war of aggression against a unsympathetic regime, but there was no real justification there. So classical kind of conservative caution would have prevented that, but there was this very bright-eyed idealistic optimism. So I'm not saying that that I adopt Wilsonian optimism, but it has to be middle way. But it's no longer possible to maintain a pure realist position without having to work out a middle way between Wilsonianism and realism.
Thank you once again, Mantas. And now it's time to move to our second speech. I'm honored to present Nerija Putinaitė, who is associate professor.
If there are no more questions, then I will thank you and go to the Polish president's chancellery.
Yeah,
where I have things to discuss.
Good luck in the chancellery. Thank you, Mantas. As I already said, I'm honored to present Nerija Putinaitė, Associate Professor at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science here in Vilnius at the Vilnius University. Her topic today is reconciling European and national identities. And while reflecting on this topic, I remembered my dear friend, late Irena Veisaitė, one of the co-founders of Open Lithuania Foundation, theater critic and Holocaust survivor, and she always used to say that I am and always will be Jewish, Lithuanian, and European. She saw those parts of her identity as complementary, and today we see how various leaders across Europe too present those parts as self-contradictory. They present European identity as something superficial, constructed and imposed from outside, so they try to mobilize their supporters, saying that we have to resist, to defend our true national identities, and also many of them look suspiciously at various minorities living in their countries. So I think this topic is of urgent importance. How can we reconcile? So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. It's I'll speak in a bit different manner to compare with Mantas, because he spoke about such philosophical things, and I'll speak about quite and I'll speak about quite a small piece of research. My question is today how 20 years of the EU membership affected Lithuania's European identity. I wrote an article in Lithuanian language. It is quite a small one, and I made some not corrections, but I'll present it. The main ideas I'll present today. My aim in this research was to examine the dynamics of different Lithuanian European identity narratives. Mantas spoke about narratives also, but I speak about Lithuanian narratives, how Lithuanians imagine their European identity, or how Lithuanians see Europe and Europe, relation between European and national identity. And so my source was speeches delivered by Lithuanian presidents, or acting presidents. We know we had Paksas crisis, and we have Polaskas as an acting president. The speeches on Europe Day and annual addresses from 2004 and to 2023. So my goal or result is to demonstrate that the EU membership transforms national identity or national narratives of European identity, and encourages strengthening of the European identity and the elements of European identity, national identity. I research elites' perception of national identity, but I can say that it is important that presidents, as representatives of elites, they also reflect in some kind society's attitudes towards national and European identities. My starting point for this research, the small research, were key narratives of Lithuanian and European identity that I found in 2014 in my book. It was based on Anthony Smith's concept of national myth. I will not speak about methodology, but I found three narratives. I researched mostly late Soviet period and first years of Lithuanian independence, and I found three narratives. The first narrative was the fortress under siege. I'll speak more about these narratives. The fortress under siege. It is Lithuania is perceived as having pagan roots that are not somehow compatible with nowadays Europeanness, and it is portrayed as possessing a unique identity, and Europe is perceived as a kind of threat to national uniqueness. The second narrative was the catching up with Europe. This narrative, yes, Lithuania was seen as a European colony, colony that throughout history constantly strived to get closer to Europe and to catch with it. And King Mindaugas was the central figure, symbolic figure of this narrative. The third one was Lithuania between East and West. And this narrative Lithuania was understood as a nation located between East and West, some kind between Russia and West Europe, and belonging to a distinct European region with a unique European identity, which differs from the Western one, a specific region in Europe, a kind of bridge between East and West. And so I also, and it is nothing unique for Lithuania because also Smith argues that usually on these borderlands, European borderlands, elites, they perceive their national and European relationship between national and European identities in three different ways. In neo-traditionalism, that means this fortress narrative, messianistic assimilation into West, that means the catching up, and also a kind of reformism to seek to somehow to make a synthesis of this Western and their own unique culture. So, but anyway, in analyzing today, in analyzing the speeches of our presidents, I also found the new narrative. This narrative I called "We Are Europe" or "We Europe" narrative, because this narrative was not very strong at the beginning of the accession to the EU, and it was not. It was very weak also at the beginning of our independence of the state. This narrative presents nowadays situation as a kind of golden age of and European integration also as a kind of a part of our identity and so on. So my aim in this research was to see or to reflect upon the dynamic of these narratives since the Lithuania's accession to the EU, that means 2004. And yes, and what I found, I found that this, I'll start from the catching up with Europe. This narrative, the dynamic of this narrative is regressive. It was very prominent and very strong at the beginning of Lithuania's EU membership, and starts to weaken, and eventually already 2018, 2019, it became marginalized and nearly imperceptible. I speak about speeches, of our presidents. And what is interesting that at the beginning, Lithuania's engagement in all these European matters was understood as an effort to learn a lot, to adopt European rules, to adopt European experience. That means this catching up. And Lithuania was seen as a laggard, and also in some spheres, and these spheres were also named, and so about 2014, that means 10 years after the Lithuania's accession to the EU, this narrative began to weaken, and it was said in speeches of presidents that we can celebrate because we we already achieved success. We are in a very rapid modernization, but we already achieved quite a big success in catching up with Europe. And the shift was 2019. I will not speculate about the reasons of this shift, but it was in speech of Dalia Grybauskaitė when she said that Lithuania not only works according to the European agenda, we also shape it because we have something to offer for the future of Europe. That means that we shape European agenda, not only accept, and we shape European experience also. So this dynamic is regressive. The second narrative, Lithuania between East and West, the dynamic of this narrative is linked to the changes in content. This narrative was strong all the time, but the content changed. And I think that this change, it somehow is related to the external circumstances, to the Russia's actions mostly. And now this narrative overlaps also with other narratives. I'll say some words about that. Yes. At the beginning of the accession to the EU, during the first years, Lithuania, in speeches, Lithuania was presented as a mediator between East and West Europe, as having ability to solve conflicts, to develop dialogue with Russia mostly, and also it was stressed that Lithuania belongs to a very distinct region, somehow implicating, this idea was implicating that this region was distinct from European West. And the narrative, the content of narrative changed, as I said, and it is perceived that, of course, that we are, that Lithuania is not a peripheral state already, but a kind of member of Europe. And Lithuania does not belong to a kind of region in Europe, but is full, very equal member of between European nation states, and its identity is based on more Europe, more courage to act together in the world, and somehow Lithuania till now is perceived as a kind of mediator, but not a mediator between Western Europe and East, but a mediator inside Europe, as a kind of European member that has a specific role within the European Union to mediate and to somehow, because Lithuania have this experience and understand and ability to understand Eastern countries better than West Europeans. So this narrative is still present, but its content changed, and Lithuania itself does not marginalize itself, does not think about itself as a kind of being outside Western Europe, but as being inside the European Union. The fortress under siege, this narrative was not very popular even during the accession of the EU, to the EU, and it was very strange. Of course, it is not good for a researcher to have a kind of issue, because it would be more interesting for me to have more strong positions about this fortress narrative, but what is interesting that this narrative also transforms now, and it may transform and even resurface in a new form. For example, it is related to the narrative "We Europe," and there are also signs that already Europe and we Europe, we understand Europe as a fortress under siege. And we try to give this narrative to Europeans, to other Europeans, that Europe now is fortress under siege. So this transformation is very slight now. I saw only some aspects of it, but I think that it can strengthen this position, and especially when Mantas presented his ideas, I think that he speaks about democracy under siege. So we can go. It can be very productive. And we are Europe. This narrative was not very strong at the beginning of EU membership. But it was present, but the definition was very narrow, and over time it became the main narrative. I think that now it's the most prominent narrative. At the beginning, as I said, Artūras Paulauskas in his speech said a very interesting phrase. That we became true European members, full and equal, but not on equal terms. Bet nelygiaverčiai, not on equal terms. We are equal, but not on equal terms, and it was self-reflection. It was not a kind of reproach to others, but it was a self-reflection. And so the new reality is also about 2014, when Lithuania said it was a kind of, when Grybauskaitė said that we are building Lithuania and Europe together, it is still separation between Lithuania and Europe, but she also stressed all the time that in some cases we are already ahead of other countries, and we can give something to Europe also. So also this symbolic shift occurred in 2019 when Grybauskaitė said that our challenges are also becoming the challenges of all of Europe and the concern of all Europe. Europe is us. So Grybauskaitė made this shift, a symbolic shift in her speeches, and it is perhaps interesting what is the main content of this "We Europe." Why are we suddenly we Europe? And it is related somehow to the topic of this conference, because one of the most interesting things that our ability to overcome crisis is understood that we are already full members of European Union because we are able ourselves. We are able to act and to successfully overcome crisis. And it is especially 2008 crisis, financial crisis, and those also COVID crisis strengthen this narrative or this self-perception as we are kind of self-respect, I would say, also. But also it is very important that that the recognition, it is a state, a kind of, I say that it's a state status, self-reflection of state status, and also recognition by other countries of the status. Also, in the speeches, I found also this self-respect or proud, or how to say, based also on the achievement of economic prosperity. We are not laggards. It was said, we are not laggards. So it was very important symbolically to say that. And also this, it is connected with the exhaustion of catching up narrative. So it is based on Lithuania's confidence in its own strength as a state. It's not like that we, so it was very interesting for me, this difference in understanding the sovereignty of the state. Somehow the idea of sovereignty of state transformed also during these years. So the conclusions. About these narratives that the catching up of Europe disappeared, we narrative strengthened, and what was unexpected for me, it was this transformation, quite a big transformation of these narratives, and I can make the conclusions that being in the EU itself strongly influences the national identity narratives. It would be interesting to see also in other countries, and it increased the elements of weight of European identity in the narrative of national identity. I ask myself what would happen if Lithuania would not be so successful in dealing with crisis. So, but it is perhaps. These external crises were crucial in strengthening the self-proud and self-awareness and also strengthening the European identity. So that is what I wanted to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Nerija. Let's agree that we will postpone the questions up until our third and last speaker finishes his presentation. Then we will also have coffee break, and we will be able to continue our discussions at the coffee cup. Our third speaker is Simas Čelutka, who is a researcher at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science, the same institute as Nerija. Simas will speak about sacrifice, Ukraine, and the future of post-heroic Europe. Words of Brecht's drama about Galileo came into my mind. In this drama, Galileo says that after he's forced to denounce his scientific discovery, that unfortunate is the nation that needs heroes. And actually, we can interpret these words now as a statement which says that actually, in the normal times, heroes maybe are not needed, but when we live in these kind of exceptional times with severe geopolitical challenges, this heroic mentality is valuable. And can we recover this mentality if Europe entered this post-heroic state of being? So, dear Simas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and I'm glad to share my thoughts. And I want to begin from a recent poll conducted in Austria. The first question that was put to Austrians: if Austria is attacked militarily, should other EU member states support Austria militarily? How many said yes, do you think?
80.
Yeah, it's close enough. 72% said yes. The second question, and it's getting more interesting. Should Austria come to the aid of another EU country with armed troops in the event of an armed attack? How many said yes?
22.
8%. 13%, so 1-3. And the third question is the most interesting one. In the event of an armed attack on Austria, would you personally be prepared to defend your country with a weapon? How many said yes? 14%. No?
We can try because they will not resist.
So this is only one of the polls. There are others. A recent global Gallup poll showed that the willingness of citizens to defend their countries is rapidly diminishing, especially in Western countries. This raises serious questions about the future of Europe in these increasingly uncertain times. For me personally, Russia's war against Ukraine, and especially Ukrainians' heroic determination to defend their homeland, has sparked a lively interest in such concepts and phenomena as sacrifice, courage, and political freedom. How can we explain this determination in the case of Ukrainians and the palpable lack thereof in the case of many Europeans? Does Europe possess an intellectual capacity and an adequate vocabulary to capture the essence of sacrifice? Serious doubts regarding this were conveyed by the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who, in a text written just 2 months after the invasion, argued that although Europeans admire Ukrainians' resolve and courage, they cannot fully empathize with them because Europe is in the grip of what he called the post-heroic mentality. It's an echo of an argument Habermas made long time ago when he wrote in one of his books, "Enlightenment morality does away with sacrifice." Why? Because in a purely rational universe where equally rational agents meet each other to deliberate and seek compromises, there is no need anymore for conflict, struggle, risk-taking, heroic deeds, radical decisions, and extreme life and death situations. This is the reason why it is so difficult for many in the West to rise to the call of responsibility and fully appreciate the deeper meaning of Ukraine's sacrifice. What precludes the identification of the phenomenon of sacrifice and its moral existential import? How can we explain the current misalignment between the political elites in Western and Central Eastern Europe? Many in the West have been complacent after the fall of the Berlin Wall and Fukuyama's declaration that the end of history was reached. The Western elites saw liberal democracy as an unrivaled pinnacle of human development, the last stop in the march of progress, and accordingly, history and politics were willingly abolished in favor of economics, trade, international law, and abstract morality. No real decisions or sacrifices needed to be made anymore. In this post-historical era, people don't even need to cultivate any traditional virtues anymore, especially courage. Why on earth would you need courage in this post-historical paradise? The whole of Europe is seen as a big safe space where you only meet like-minded liberals in a broad sense, at most respectful opponents who listen to each other and aspire to find common ground and eventually seek consensus. In this picture of social reality, not only politics and history become obsolete, but the meaning of freedom invariably changes. It becomes disentangled from responsibility. Freedom becomes purely negative. Don't interfere, stay away from me. I am pursuing my own interests. No one can tell me anything. This is the reason why in Lithuania and many other European countries, it is still very difficult to talk about conscription. People believe that someone else will sacrifice for their homeland in times of crisis. Why should it be me? How can the state presume that it has the right to take me out of my life and to ruin my career? The prevalence of this individualistic worldview confirms the fact that we are losing the sense of positive freedom. Not freedom from, but freedom to. Freedom to do something meaningful, to care for this common world of ours, to act responsibly, to build and think about the future. I believe that this is precisely the gift of Ukraine to all of us today, a unique chance to become historical and responsible agents once again, to rise up to the call of responsibility, to become engaged actors instead of passive or frightened spectators, or worse, just indifferent consumers. In this context, it is worthwhile to return to the rich moral and political philosophy of two seminal thinkers of the 20th century, the German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt and the Czech thinker Jan Patočka. Arendt went back to the Greeks and tried to retrieve an original meaning of the concept of politics. The result of this intellectual journey was Arendt's claim that politics is unimaginable without a citizen's willingness to sacrifice for the greater good, without an understanding that one is part of a larger whole. Political responsibility requires from us to transcend our private interests for the sake of the common world. In authentic politics, concern for the fate of the world takes precedence over satisfaction of biological or economic needs. It takes courage to leave the protective security of one's private sphere and to devote oneself to the affairs of the city, exposing oneself to the light of publicity and judgmental gaze of others, including one's adversaries. And that's certainly not easy, not always comfortable, and sometimes dangerous. That's why courage becomes the supreme political virtue in Arendt's political thought. Quote, "Courage liberates men from their worry about life for the freedom of the world." Courage is indispensable because in politics, not life, but the world is at stake, unquote. This distinction between life and world is crucial for Arendt, where life is understood as private and biological, and world as intersubjective and cultural political. Arendt says that for a true citizen, the fate of the world is more important than personal gain or individual happiness. She takes inspiration from Machiavelli, who, as she writes, was more interested in Florence than in salvation of his soul. This form of political self-transcendence gives birth to a very peculiar feeling that Arendt, following the American founding fathers, describes as public happiness. For political actors, participation in political affairs is not a burden or a nuisance, but a form of enjoyment which they know cannot be experienced anywhere else except in public with others. Public happiness, again, refers to something that cannot be reduced or assimilated to individual happiness. This raises the question for us today. Do we recognize this notion of public happiness? It seems that for most people today, only individual happiness is the form of happiness. And this is a clear sign of our depoliticized mindset. Today in the West, many people do not feel as citizens, but merely as inhabitants of certain territories. Today's life is built upon the primacy of economics, work, career, and entertainment. The dominance of social media and algorithmic governance alienates us from each other, from strangers, and ultimately from ourselves. For most people, public participation boils down to casting a ballot every 4 or 5 years, or occasionally clicking a like or hate button in social media. We've become passive spectators at best and apathetic, indifferent individuals at worst. That's why I think that today we should try to retrieve the materiality of the public space, be it town halls, councils, public discussions, or something of that sort, to try to recreate a public space as a space of appearance. Online world lacks this element of direct eye-to-eye engagement with one's peers that is characteristic of a human conversation. Direct engagement, especially if nourished by a willingness to listen, is a civilizing practice that allows for nuances to spring up in the process of conversation and eventually mitigate one's ideological fervor. Whereas online tweeting and commenting tends to erase the presence of real humanity, sharpening the tribal lens through which we view words on screens. But how can we recapitulate this material side of a public space in present circumstances? That's, of course, an open question. But one thing is clear: we have to at least occasionally dare to leave our cozy private lives and enter the risky realm of public affairs. This is the only way to feel part of the larger whole and become responsible for it. Jan Patočka was a philosopher who not only wrote about the meaning of sacrifice in the technological age, but in fact himself embodies the morality of sacrifice. In 1977, at the end of his life, Patočka decided to take a risk and become a spokesperson of the famous Charter 77 dissident movement in Czechoslovakia. When Václav Havel approached him with this request, Patočka hesitated for a while because of his advanced age and failing health, but eventually he dared to accept the challenge. He took a leading role in a movement and within a couple of months published 2 important texts in the Samizdat explaining the Charter's moral meaning. These texts put moral principles, especially human rights, ahead of political calculations and thus provided a normative moral dimension to the whole movement. The circulation of these texts in the underground further strengthened the resolve of the dissidents, but also intensified the regime's attacks on Patočka. He was repeatedly interrogated, and after the last interrogation, which lasted about 12 hours, his health deteriorated rapidly and he died a few days later. In those 2 influential Charta 77 texts, Patočka forcefully argued that there are things, certain principles or moral ideals worth dying for. His own actions embody a rare occurrence in intellectual life when the words and deeds of an intellectual in fact go together. High-sounding rhetoric becomes empty if it's not backed up and corroborated by experience and concrete actions. As he writes in one of those Charta texts, quote, "Our people have once more become aware that there are things for which it is worthwhile to suffer, that the things for which we might have to suffer are those which make life worthwhile, and that without them, all our arts, literature, and culture become mere trades, leading only from the desk to the pay office and back," unquote. What mattered to Patočka was the fact that the technological, or as he called it, techno-scientific worldview prevents us from acknowledging and appreciating the moral meaning of self-sacrifice. From a technological or scientific point of view, sacrifice is impossible. It's only utilization of resources. That's why there's so much cynicism today in the West regarding Ukraine. Ukrainians are robbed of subjectivity, regarded only as cogs, statistics, small pieces in a giant geopolitical chessboard. Ukrainian soldiers and citizens are seen as resources, as a standing reserve of energy next to tanks and weapons. In this context, it becomes very difficult to generate what Patočka famously called the solidarity of the shaken, solidarity of co-sufferers who find themselves in the common situation of fragility and vulnerability, an overwhelming and tragic encounter with evil. Such solidarity is lacking when people and nations care only about themselves. National egoism, often cloaked in the rhetoric of national sovereignty, prevents the emergence of a wider and more substantial solidarity with those who are weaker and suffer massive violations of dignity and freedom. That's why both Arendt and Patočka were quite critical of the modern idea of sovereignty, with Arendt claiming that true freedom can only be experienced under the condition of non-sovereignty or plurality. Unfortunately, despite all the horrors of Russia's war against Ukraine, the latter has still not shaken Europe existentially. Many want to go back to business as usual with no real change in their perceptions and daily habits. And part of the blame goes to technology, again, especially to global media and social media, which is one of the prime examples of contemporary technology. When you see war footage in the news, it becomes routinized. Only one news piece among many other news. And gradually we become desensitized, confused, ambiguous, and finally indifferent. And indifference, this is a very important ethical term. When formulating his concept of sacrifice, Patočka says that sacrifice is a return of non-indifference, of a sense that there are higher and lower things in life. Technology, by contrast, makes us believe that there is only pure immanence, pure horizontality, where nothing really matters, everything is relative, where, as Peter Pomerantsev famously said, nothing is true and everything is possible. Ukrainians who embody courage, sacrifice, and believe in certain principles give us a rare chance to wake up, to be shaken out of our cozy, comfortable, habitual worldview, what Patočka sometimes calls everydayness, sometimes bondage to life. Ukrainians give us a chance to make a leap from the shallow anonymity and boredom to a level of authentically human existence where we begin to care about something more, something that surpasses our enslavement to material things and comfort. And I'm almost finishing. I strongly believe that we as intellectuals have a very clear duty today to listen to Ukrainians, to Ukrainian voices. They need to be heard as loudly as possible, and we need to understand what exactly they are telling us. And that's why I want to end with two quotes by well-known Ukrainian intellectuals. In a recent essay, a Ukrainian philosopher, Volodymyr Yermolenko, argues that there are two hearts of Europe, two different ethics or moralities which are distinctive to Europe. I quote here, "One is the ethics of agora, It presumes an ethic of exchange. In the agora, we give away something to get more than we had. We exchange goods, objects, ideas, stories, and experiences. The agora is a positive-sum game. Everyone wins, even though some try to win more than others. The other ethical system is that of agon. Agon is a battlefield. We enter agon not to exchange, but to fight. We dream of winning, but are also prepared to lose, including to lose ourselves, even in the literal sense of dying for a great cause. This is not the logic of a positive-sum game. There can be no win-win, because one of the sides will certainly lose. Europe has built itself as a combination of agora and agon. It bears the image of both the knight and the bourgeois. Europe's cultural legacy is unthinkable without the ethics of agon, whether it be medieval novels with their cult of chivalry and loyalty, or early modern dramas whose characters stand and die for their principles and passions. But Europe is also unthinkable without the culture of agora, of conversation, of compromise, of softness, unquote. Yarmolenko rightly asserts that today's Europe wants to practice exclusively the ethics of agora. There is a palpable disequilibrium between these two ethics today. The ethics of agon, the ethics of courage. This is what Europeans need to remember today and to give it sufficient weight and consideration. We should question Habermas's notion of post-heroic mentality and ask, can the political be sustained without a willingness to sacrifice? Perhaps we should listen more to Alasdair MacIntyre and Paul Kahn, who convincingly argue that liberal morality is parasitic, or at least heavily dependent upon the non-liberal morality, MacIntyre calls it patriotism, that is practiced by many citizens in our liberal societies. In other words, today's liberal thinkers tend to overlook the ground on which they stand and develop their lofty ideals. But I want to end with an optimistic note. A famous Ukrainian historian, Yaroslav Hrytsak, writes in his latest book, Ukraine, the Forging of a Nation. I quote, "Ukrainian history provides a foundation for a limited but defensible optimism. It's not unique in that sense. Just think of David and Goliath, the Greco-Persian Wars, the fall of fascism and communism, the stories of Frodo and Harry Potter. It doesn't matter whether these stories are fictional or real. What matters is that they remind us that the devil, in the Bible or in the history, is a pathetic creature. He can destroy, enslave, and corrupt, but he cannot win." Thank you.
Thank you, dear Simas. It's 5 p.m., so we are about to enter the coffee break, but if you have one or two questions, so I think we are good to go.
Yes, I think I'll quickly ask then. Thank you very much. Well, Simas gave this dark tone, but much needed. But my question is to Nerija Putinaitė. Indeed, very interesting. The sort of new perspectives of European identity. I remember reading the book well several years ago, and this triad of the perspectives and narratives on the European and national identity, but on the current perspectives and the narratives of what concerns national, Lithuanian, and European identity. You mentioned that Fortress Under Siege narrative, and I wonder to ask about sort of a nuance of this narrative, which is gaining ground, in my view, currently, since Germany, since the start of the war, in terms that Lithuania is the sort of a gate of Europe, in terms that we are on the front line. That's the word, the front line of Europe. And the metaphors, of course, are from the Cold War, but West Berlin, Checkpoint Charlie, that famous crossing between the East and West Germany. So that is my question. Do you see? So the first question: do you see any perspective on this narrative, or whether it's some sort of completely different mammal? And the other sort of a narrative, which I see not transmitted not by Lithuanians or even by Europeans, but by Americans, sadly, that they are calling not Lithuanians but this whole region from Finland to Bucharest to Romania as the new Europe, and in comparison, and this in some way echoes Simas' address, in comparison with the old Europe, and in this sense, a new Europe is as they say, especially Republicans, current Republicans, who are sort of, and we have a negative approach towards Germany and France, especially, and they see New Europe as the trustworthy, virtuous, and vibrant, whereas they see Germany and France as old, as hypocritic, as greedy, as arrogant, and this. So how do you see that the sort of the other part, in the sense Americans could some way influence our own self-understanding of ourselves, sort of. So yes, and of course the new Nordics. This is the last point, but I'll just leave it. Yeah. So.
We can listen to the podcast of Lukas Romanas.
Thank you. I researched this narratives that appeared somehow in speeches of presidents, it is a very interesting idea about this dynamics. Is our self-perception more as more dynamic nations? I didn't have this question, but perhaps it is very interesting to also to look through all these speeches from this perspective. It would be interesting, but there is as a kind of there is no a contrast in speeches. There is no a kind of stress upon things like, for example, that we are dynamic and this old Europe is somehow very passive and dying and so on. And this depends perhaps on the specifics of the role of president and perhaps on the specifics of the speeches. But I think that it is possible perhaps to find things like that in other sources. It is perhaps possible. So my research was restricted. And about this fortress you mentioned, so when I mentioned that it is a possibility or potential in this narrative to become this narrative of fortress under the siege, Europe as a fortress. So it is, I meant that it is this border of Lithuania was presented as a border of Europe, and we and threat to the border of Europe, and we only are the first on the other side of this border, but not that we are a target. Europe could be a target, not we would be a target, and would the Russia or Belarus would attack. So it is this kind of hints in these speeches. I also somehow I found these hints, but they are not very, perhaps perhaps with the dynamics of the war and how the war will proceed and so on, perhaps this will be much stronger or much weaker. So it's everything under dynamics now.
Okay, one more time for one more question. I didn't see any hands, so very brief question for you, Simas. You spoke about the duty of intellectuals, and in this era that we are living in, having social networks, we read, we like or dislike on Facebook, and then we forget very fast. Do you see at the moment any public intellectuals, like you quoted Patočka, who was not just reflecting and writing, but sacrificed, as you said himself, for the cause of Charter 77? So at the moment, do we have intellectuals that would be able to inspire, mobilize people like in Europe, or is just like we start living in a parallel universes where the majority of people live like separately, and then the intellectuals, they organize conferences, and, but it doesn't change anything. And as you said, like if the war in Ukraine didn't wake us up, so how can we wake up?
Yeah, so I mean, all of that can be just simply brushed aside by saying that, well, if an actual aggression would come to, for instance, Austria's borders, they will somehow quickly mobilize and just out of necessity, they will have to defend themselves and everything will be fine. So there is no point in actually even talking about that. And this discussion actually is also present in Lithuania. So how can we prepare for the war while at the same time not being, you know, super paranoid and militaristic and so on? Because people, while there is still no war, they would love to live as, you know, a usual life, right? So that raises this important question, what the preparation would then have to entail, right? So on the one hand, you could say only, you know, material stuff like tanks, weapons, and so on, and that's enough. But many politicians and activists and so civil society are also talking about the will to defend on the part of the citizenry, right? So not only having enough weapons or systems, but also this mental and psychological and moral preparation as well. But how can that take place in the times which are still seem peaceful for us? That's a big question. Now, regarding the intellectuals, actually, I feel the lack of their voice today. I mean, of course, in the US, we have Timothy Snyder, who is perhaps the most active one in this regard, especially his attempts to raise awareness in the West regarding Ukraine. He's unparalleled in that. In Ukraine itself, we of course see such beautiful examples as Serhiy Zhadan, who is a famous poet and musician, and now he I know a year ago or some months ago, actually finally decided to enter the war himself personally, and that is, of course, a big inspiration to many in Ukraine. So there are maybe some examples, but I don't know much about Western European countries. That's a question maybe to others who follow the internal public debates in those countries.
I would like to give some different perspective for this question, because I think this role of intellectuals is very important in authoritarian states. But in democratic states, we have these simple people, as we say, and the intellectuals are also simple people, because we have so many volunteers in Lithuania that really sacrifice their own personal life, and they help Ukrainians. So I think that we don't need to speak about some kind of big intellectuals who sacrifice, but we should see these simple people who had their own works and so on, but they give much of their time for helping in different ways. So I think that is also that shows that democracy changes a lot and gives possibility to the society to get involved in this. So I think that also in Western countries we could see all these islands of societal initiatives also.
Okay, thank you, Nerija. Thank you, Simas. Thanks for Mantas too. He joined us from Warsaw, and now it's coffee break up until 5:30.
Thank you.